Today we are talking about stop sounds. The definition of a stop sound is a ringing technique or articulation that produces pitch but no resonance. And there are a variety of techniques that we use for uh, uh, a variety of techniques to create different sounds to make our music more interesting. Before I talk about the techniques a little bit, I would just like to remind you of things we spoke about in our earlier sessions, and that would be that the handbell produces two pitches, the fundamental at the lip, the 12th in the overtone series at the waist of the bell, and in order for the other diameters of the casting not to be heard, the casting is thinned out in the center of the casting. This is going to be important to recognize as we do some of these ringing techniques so that we don't damage our castings. One of the first techniques ever created in the world of handbells was the pizzicato, which later became the pluck. And this technique was used widely in the 1970s and was one of the few techniques that were used at the beginning of the ringing movement. And it was created to imitate that of a pizzicato string. So when we pluck, the handbell castings should be lying on the table, and we use the clapper assembly by picking up the clapper assembly and turning our wrist and dropping the clapper assembly into the casting for a pluck. Now, when this technique was first created, music was not as complicated as it is today, and so it was taught that you use one hand to hold the bell in place, and the other, I'm using fingers 2 and 3, to pick up the clapper assembly, and then I'm just merely turning my wrist to have the clapper head fall into the casting. So it's very easy just to hold the handle of the bell and go back and forth. And that was sufficient for the very early years in ringing. But as music became more popular, we were then ringing simultaneously or plucking simultaneously or very quickly. And so we would have to pluck two bells together, or so the easiest way to make that work, there's an issue when we get into plucking in the higher, from G5 on up, that the bells tend to roll around a little bit when we pluck because the weight of the casting no longer holds them on the table. So what I like to do is I like to take my handbells and I just pull them back to the edge of the table and basically lean them into my legs here, and that holds the castings into place so that they don't jump around or roll around on me, and I can pluck together without holding the handles or back and forth. So that is a very simple way to use the pluck technique. I will say that some people like to demonstrate the pluck by just taking two fingers and putting it on the outside of the clapper assembly and just throwing it up. But remember, what comes up comes down, and you get a double ring that way. You'll get a much more musical pluck by lifting the clapper head and throwing it down. And I'm using my thumb and the twist of my wrist to do the pluck technique. Hyosung Park and Cynthia Reagan are our Zoom hosts today. I'd like to ask Hyosung if she would pull up the first screen, which is an example of plucking in the score. Thank you, Hyosung. And so if you see there in measure 83, or the second measure in this example, you have a PL or an MAL, meaning pluck or mallet with staccato dots. The big thing in handbell ringing is that a pluck or a mallet produces pretty much the same sound or articulation. So it's commonly accepted in the world of ringing that you use whichever technique that is more comfortable for your ringers. Okay, so a pluck in the score is usually shown by PL with staccato dots. Thanks, Yosung. The next technique that we're going to talk about is also a pluck, but it's called a tap pluck. A tap pluck. And it's not a technique that you'll see very often printed in the handbell score, but it's one that you know to use if plucking is there and it's difficult to do. So first of all, I would use the tap pluck when the score had a dynamic level for plucking of a piano or a pianissimo. And what a tap pluck is I'm just using my thumb pad and I'm just knocking on the clapper assembly, on the clapper head. So the important thing is that you have to treat this clapper head as if you're touching a hot iron or just checking the temperature of something. The last thing that we want to do is just push the clapper head into the casting. We get a very dead sound, but what we want is we want to tap the clapper head so it will bounce right off the casting and we get a more musical sound. So this is a G4 handbell. This is my pluck. And this is my tap pluck. With a tap pluck, I can control dynamics better. So I would use a tap pluck when the score calls for a very soft dynamic marking. The other time that I would use a tap pluck is when I have a repeated pattern of plucks. There's a wonderful piece by the composer Mary McCleary that was published back in the 1980s, and I remember it very clearly that it had a pluck and 4/16 notes, and so it was 1E and a 2. So we had 4/16 notes, which would be very difficult to pluck. It's very hard and unmusical, but what I can do is I can use the tap pluck. So again, I use a tap pluck for quicker rhythms and I use a tap pluck for dynamic markings. So that would be it for the pluck and the tap pluck. Are there any questions? Feel free to speak up if we can't see you.
I do not see anyone in chat.
Okay, oh yes, Bonnie.
Yeah.
Oh.
I thought you were not supposed to touch the clapper head during COVID times.
You are not. Okay, so we're trying to teach these sessions for now and for the future, but during COVID times, it's very difficult to sanitize a clapper head. So I'm wearing gloves and I will wipe down the clapper head here. This is not a set of bells that is used by a choir right now, so I think we're okay. But that's a wonderful point to bring up, that we suggest you don't touch the clapper head during COVID times. So what would I do instead of a pluck? During COVID times, I would use mallets. All right. Okay, any other questions or comments? Alrighty,
Dawn did ask what the sound difference is with mallet versus tap pluck.
Very little. With tap pluck and mallet, very little. This is my tap pluck. And this is my mallet. It all depends how hard I mallet, but I get the same timbre from both the tap pluck and the mallets. And are we good to move on? Okay, so on our higher bells, the castings are too small. to get the hand into them to pluck. And so therefore a new technique was developed called a thumb damp, a thumb damp. And with the thumb damp, basically, here's a little pun for you. The rule of thumb is that you put as much of your hand on the casting that you need so that you get pitch but no sustain. So here's an E6 and an F6 with just my thumbs on. If I go to a larger bell, like an F and G5, and I put my thumbs on them, you can hear there's a little bit of residual ringing going on. So I would slide up a finger or two, depending on the sound, what I get from the size of my hand, and then I'm going to thumb damp with a thumb and an extra finger. And I'm sliding my finger down a little bit. We have to be careful when we put an extra finger on the bell, and I'm just over exaggerating now, that we still get pitch from the casting. If I put too much of my hand on the casting, this is what I'll get. A castanet, okay? So I want to slide down so I just get as much pitch as I can with no sustain. So as we go down the handbell set, we want to make sure as we go down that everyone is getting the same balanced sound and not getting any residual ringing. Usually, depending on your ringers, if they're children or adults and how large their hands are, usually around A and B5, we'll need to start putting some thumbs on the castings so that you don't get that extra ring. I have a little rule in my rehearsal room that we thumb damp in the treble staff, but we don't thumb damp in the bass staff. I think this is a lot to handle if we're ringing and very quickly we have to thumb damp. Okay, we do not get a stop sound with a thumb damp on an A4. That's when we have to hand damp. And very few people can make that change from ringing to a hand damp. Alrighty, it's very difficult to do, so that's when I would use a mallet or a pluck instead of a thumb damp if it's written in the score. So it's very difficult to find a score that has a hand damp in it, but know that a hand damp is more of the thumb, okay, is more than the thumb on the casting for the thumb damping. I'm going to ask Hyo-sung to pull up the next page. I forgot to show you my example of a tap pluck. So if you could go to the next screen, Hyo-sung, please. Okay, so this is a, no, back to the one before. Thank you. Page 2, the tap pluck. Okay, we'll go back to the thumb damp. All right, so this is a great example of the thumb damp. And in a handbell score, stems are everything. So when you'll see that the TD and the staccato dots mean that the eighth notes are thumb damped. The half notes and the quarter note with the stems going up are just default ringing, ringing and damping, ringing and damping. So that's how you determine in a handbell score who does what technique. Looking to see if the notes are stemmed together or not. You'll see a very clean definition between the eighth notes and then the half notes and the quarter notes with their stems going up. So it's only the eighth notes in this particular example that do the thumb damping. Any questions on thumb damping or hand damping? Thanks, Hyo-sung. Okay. one of the greatest techniques that brings ringers pleasure because it helps us relieve a lot of frustration and delights audiences is that of the Martellato. Okay, Martellato in Italian means to hammer, and that's exactly what we do in this technique. This is the technique that I caution you the most on with remembering that your castings actually have thin walls because the castings can be damaged very easily, especially in the base staff with using this technique. So first of all, the big rule on Martellato is if you have 5 octaves of bells, you never mart below a G3. G3 is as low as we go with a Martellato. And the reason for that is because the walls of the castings become longer, and as they strike the table, they actually flex in on themselves, and they could bend and crack in the center where the casting is so thin. So we never want to go with a longer wall than a G3. Some people like to stop it at C4 at the bottom of the 3-octave set, just for an overabundance of caution, and there's nothing wrong with that. We can do other techniques to substitute for the Martellato, and no one will know better. Alrighty, so I mentioned earlier that the definition of a Martellato is to hammer, and I'm going to suggest to you that you mart in this fashion. Some people teach it in other forms, but I'd like to suggest that you hold your bell in the ready to ring position. You hold the handbell over the table no more than 3 inches. All right? Now we're not going to strike the bell into the table. Instead, I'm putting my fist into the table. The reason for this is when I think about putting my fist into the table rather than the casting, it is protective of the casting. You may know if you have a very old set of handbells that sometimes when your ringers carry more than 2 bells at once to the cases to put the handbells away after rehearsal, they sometimes hit the bells together and then you get little nicks in the lip of your bell. Well, unfortunately, when you mart by striking the lip of the casting into the table, that will aggravate those little nicks in the lip and they could lead to cracks. However, when I'm using my fist to put the handbell into the table, the entire instrument is bearing the stress of the strike into the table rather than just the lip, so it's much safer. The reason why I love using the fist more than the handbell casting is because oftentimes when, especially new choirs, use the Martellato technique, because the bass bells are larger than the treble bells, we always get a little bit of a gallop, boom, 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 from our marts, and that's because the large bells hit the table quicker than our treble bells, and so we always get that little stampede sound. People can judge distance better with just their hands rather than using an object. So if they're putting their fist into the table, your choir will be more apt to get a precise chord right on one than getting that rolling sound of the bass to the treble. So I really, really like those clean chords from using the fist instead of the handbell. The third reason why I like to use my fist is I've been to enough handbell concerts in my life to know that a lot of people think of the Martellato technique as a dynamic marking rather than an articulation. So you're hearing a lovely, beautiful piece, and all of a sudden you hear boom, 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 and the marts are way out of balance from the rest of the music. And I don't think they're intended to be that way. I think they're intended to be a stop sound, but I don't think they're meant to be much louder than the rest of the score. So when we use our fist, we actually can control the dynamic of the Martellato. And so I can have a Mart that sounds like this. I can have a Mart marked pianissimo. They're hard to find, but they are out there. We can have a pianissimo Mart just by the amount of force I'm using with my fist into the table, or I can have a Mart that is fortissimo. Either way, both of them work, but it all depends on the score that we're using. So I would say, I think it's fair to say that 3/4 of the Marts that we hear are too loud, and that if we soften up a little bit, it will be great for our music and even better for our instruments. Over the years, I started ringing when I was in 7th grade, so that was a little while ago. And over the years, the Martillato technique has changed quite a bit too. Early on, we were taught just to throw the lip of the casting into the table, and I addressed that earlier that that's not such a good idea. The second technique for marting that was mentioned was just to strike the bell at the edge of the table and mart that way. Well, that's not so good because only half the casting is on the pad. And the other thing is that sometimes the pads will slip forward on the table when ringers lean over to move to turn pages. And the next thing you know, you're striking your casting on the edge of the table rather than the pad. So it's really important to keep the entire bell over the pad and just use the fist. Just use the fist to strike in. And I will ask Hyosung to pull up our musical example. Okay, and so here's our example of a Martellato. You will see in measure 121 that the G5, F5, D5, and B natural, the eighth notes there are all to Mart. Okay, the G4 has its stem going down and its stem to the G3 with the R underneath it in measure 121. So it is just default ringing and damping, while the treble bells with the stems going up are shaking in 121. This continues. However, if you take a look at measure 123, whoever this composer or editor of this piece was very smart. They know that we can mart a G3, but we can't mart an F3. So in this instance, we have a plus sign with a staccato dot, meaning we are going to mart all of the bells in the bass in that measure except for the F3. To protect it, we are going to use a mallet while the casting is lying on the table. Okay, so great. That is a wonderful example of a mart. Thanks, Hyosung. Alrighty, also in that example, which we also have another one, was an RT, and Hyosung addressed that last week, but that is a ring touch. Ring touch is also a stop sound because we want pitch with no sustain. Basically, the ring touch is ring the bell and damp it as quickly as possible. All right, usually they're used at the end of a piece to give a little bit more pizzazz, but again, there's nothing to it except you ring close to the body and damp as quickly as possible. And Hyosung, if you could pull up that example. There it is in 124. The RT and the treble, and I believe we have another example on the next page. On the next page, we have another example. There we go. So at the end of, no, at the end of 124 it is again, but on the next page there should be a ring touch example. There we go. Okay, so we have some shakes here and then the ring touch. Alrighty, now we are going to talk about, we just saw in that one example that sometimes we have to mallet instead of Mart. We're also, during that time, to protect the larger castings, if we don't mart one of the base castings, we then either mallet or pluck. What happens if we have a Mart Lift? Now, a Mart Lift is when we have the bell and we strike our fist into the table and we immediately bring the bell in the air to allow it to resonate. I'd like to think of the pad, the table pad, almost as a trampoline. Again, we're going to touch very quickly with our fist and bring the bell up. So if I'm Mart lifting a half note, I'm going to move the bell for the duration of the half note, because remember, the motion in the bell is the breath support for the sound. So if we have a large bell and we can't Mart lift, perhaps we can Pluck lift. And again, we're doing the same thing as soon as the clapper head strikes the casting, we raise the casting off the table. Pluck lift. And we would use that in our lower 5th, 6th, and 7th octave bells instead of a Mart lift when we cannot Mart those larger castings. Okay, very good. So we have the Mallet Lift and the Pluck Lift. Now we're going to talk about showing you a musical example for the Mart Lift. The Mart Lift. If Hyosung, I'll invite Hyosung to share her screen. So I'm looking for the Mart Lift.
Hyosung says we don't have an example in the PowerPoint for that.
Okay. Alrighty, so what the Mart Lift is it's a Mart with an arrow next to it, a Mart with an arrow next to it. And then earlier today we talked about plucking, and we said that you can certainly substitute the use of mallets instead of plucking. Let's talk about mallets. First of all, with mallets, we always want to purchase mallets from your handbell manufacturer. These are the folks who have designed the thickness of the castings, the profile of the casting. We know what these castings can withstand more than anybody else. And so we do see when folks are buying percussion mallets or Orff mallets and they're using them on their bells, sometimes the mallets are going right through the walls of the casting and damaging the casting. So we really want to caution you to please use the proper mallets for your bells. So mallets come in different colors, as you know. A lot of them are yarn wrapped. Some of them are just nylon. And the reason why they are different colors is because it allows us to know what the density or durometer of the ball is underneath the yarn, so we know if it's softer or harder. And so the colors of the mallets are very important. In the Malmark mallet line, the softer the mallet, the lighter the color. So light blue goes to red, goes to gray. So we also designed our mallets here at Malmark so that the heads are crocheted. The reason for that is so that you get a little bit extra padding against the casting and a better bounce. They are not meant to be struck on the lip of the casting because that will obviously cut the yarn fibers, but they're meant to be struck just below the lip in this spot here. My first rule with mallets is you never want to hold your mallet. Never want to hold your mallet. The reason for that is if you are gripping your mallet too firmly, the mallet will strike the bell, but there will be no bounce, and therefore no music. So it's going to be very important that the mallet is suspended in our hand. But I like to tell ringers, and I'll just remove my glove for a second, is I like to put the end of the mallet shaft in the center of my palm. The bottom of the mallet shaft is going to be where the mallet strikes and sort of catapults off. So I'm putting the center of my mallet shaft in the center of my palm. I'm sliding up my thumb just to where it's comfortable. That's where you're going to hold the mallet, wherever your thumb falls on the mallet shaft. Using my thumb pad, I'm allowing the thumb pad and the first knuckle to hold the mallet, and you can see the mallet is just rocking back and forth, and the bottom of the shaft of the mallet is striking my palm, so I get a really nice catapult. Then when I use the mallet on the casting, the mallet never stays there. It always bounces off or on the table as well. So first rule with mallets is you never hold them. You suspend them between your thumb pad and your first knuckle. The second rule in mallets is we always want each ringer to have 2 mallets. I know it can be costly in the beginning, especially. What I would recommend is usually beginning music does not have as much malleting in. Maybe you can invest in 1 mallet per ringer and then additionally add on as the skills of the ringers increase. However, it is important that that each ringer have 2 mallets when we have repeated notes on 1 bell. And the reason for that is if I use 1 mallet on 1 bell, it's very easy for gravity to pull the mallet head and for me to rush the tempo by restriking the bell. If I have 2 mallets, I can alternate. And not rush. The other thing I can do is I can always put beat 1 on my right hand, which is my stronger hand, and add a little pulse to the sound. So that's why we use 2 mallets, because we never want to repeat a pitch. We always want to alternate so that your ringers won't rush. Now, if there's 2 bells striking together at once, you have to use 1 mallet, but we try to get away from it as much as possible. So with mallets, the important thing is 2 mallets per ringer, never hold it, strike right below the lip of the casting, not on the lip. And I know as a director, sometimes we're just happy that our ringer strikes the bell at the right time. We really don't care where they strike it, but it is important. We don't want to strike in the center of the casting. That is the danger zone area. And the larger the casting, the more it is so much easier to strike right in that center. But we want to keep it near the lip, where the casting is thicker and where we're getting fundamental pitch instead of overtone. Okay, Hyo-sung, would you please pull up our musical example of mallets? So you can see there in the example, it's a mallet with a staccato dot, And so that means the mallet, the plus sign always means mallet, and then the staccato dot tells us it's going to be malleted with the castings on the table. If the dots weren't there, we'd be holding them up in the air. And just like a Mart Lift, if we are substituting a mallet strike for a Mart, we can do the same thing. We're going to put one hand on the casting, we're going to mallet and lift. So Hyosung, if you'll please turn to the next example.
She says there is not another example.
Okay, well, I don't know where that little devil went, but it is in your workshop handouts today. And if you look at Mallet Lift on beat 2 of measure 25, the first example there in the bass, you can see we have 2 F3s, 8th notes, and then a Mallet Lift. All right, are there any questions about mallets? Does anyone have any questions about mallets or any of the stop sounds we talked about today? So folks, with any of these stop sounds that you use, I would say if the score is marked forte, approach it as a mezzo forte. Because of these stop sounds, they're always going to sound louder than they actually are because there's no resonance. There's no dissipation of sound. It's just a very strong attack. The other reason for that, of course, is when you ring a handbell, our eye can't see it, but the bell is actually vibrating. It is moving, and it's moving freely in the air. When I strike a bell with a mallet, the casting is also vibrating and moving in the air because it's making sound. When the bell casting is on the table and I strike it with a mallet, in order to produce that sound, that strike, the casting is vibrating. However, the table impedes it from vibrating as well as it does in the air. So whenever your castings are lying on a table, they become more brittle. They become more brittle because they don't have the freedom to vibrate, and therefore, because they're more brittle, they're more fragile. So it's really important, if you just pull back on all these stop sounds, that they will carry, but they don't need the strike that a bell does in the air. So if there aren't any further questions today, we'd like to thank you for joining us.
There is one more question.
Oh,
Kim and Larry are asking if there's a preferred way to hold a suspended mallet and bell.
yes. Okay, so if you have a malleted section from measures 1 through 9, all right, I'm sorry, 1 through 8, okay, in any score. The first thing that I'm going to look at is which one of my 2 bells rings in measure 9. If at measure 9 I'm going back to regular ringing and I had malleted bells 1 through 8, the first thing I'm going to do is look at measure 9 and find out which 2 of my bells, G or A, rings first. Okay, which one of those bells needs to be in the ready to ring position? So if I look and find that my G4 rings on the first beat of measure 9, that's going to tell me how I'm going to hold these bells. And I can hold them in a number of ways. If the bells never strike together, I can hold them by nestling the handles, which I like very much because it's the easiest way, and I can strike my bells like this. However, if I have quick 8th notes or the bells ring simultaneously with mallets, I'm going to have to hold them in an X position with my fingers wrapped around the handles so that I can make quick 8th notes or so that I can strike together. And what you'll need, this does require a little practice, but I think another one of the questions you might be asking, some people, it does not matter if you hold the bell with the mouth up, if you hold the mouth out, or if you hold the mouth down. The reason for that is with suspended mallets, we're looking for a more delicate sound anyway. So the bell will sound just fine in any direction, whichever is easier for the ringer. Any other questions or comments? Okay,
I think
folks,
we're
we
good.
thank you. I'm sorry?
I think we're good, Kathy.
Okay, thank you. We thank you for joining us today. You can share this episode with other folks who couldn't make it today at 4 by inviting them to view it on our YouTube channel, Malmark Bell Craftsman. Our Studio 440 sessions are there, and we'll continue next week with Shelley and Four in Hand. And Robert Lamb will be your clinician, and he will be teaching you all about these wonderful treble bell techniques. So thank you, friends. Have a wonderful week. And from all of us at Malmark, happy ringing.